NATO will have to prepare for possible Russian attacks on targets in Europe, including Germany, because the central supply lines of the bloc countries pass through it. This was stated by senior NATO generals to the Times newspaper. According to them, targets could range from ammunition factories and command centers to power plants, railroads and bridges.
We have to assume that an aggressor will use the whole spectrum of kinetic and non-kinetic force in order to destroy lines of communication, also in the rear area, that ranges from acts of sabotage through electronic warfare and cyber to kinetic possibilities through missiles, drones and so on. Alexander Zollfrank, commander of the NATO Military Logistics Center in Germany, in a comment to the Times.
Germany called on its NATO allies to be prepared for a possible future war with Russia. Berlin fears that Moscow could expand the war beyond Ukraine.
You don't know if or when this will happen, which means you need to arm yourself. And that's what we are doing now together with our NATO allies.
Preparations for a possible conflict with Russia on the scale of the entire bloc must continue. This is also the opinion of senior NATO generals. In particular, the alliance is discussing the introduction of the so-called military Schengen system. It will allow the free movement of military personnel and equipment throughout the territory of NATO countries.
For example, paratroopers are legislatively prohibited from using parachutes made for the army of another country, even if they are functionally identical. Although this may not be allowed now, technically there is no problem in many cases. Alexander Zollfrank, commander of the NATO Military Logistics Center in Germany, in a comment to the Times.
At the same time, Brussels calls for, first of all, continued support for Ukraine.
Well, there's been a spate of so-called war warnings, haven't there, over the last couple of weeks. If we don't want that to happen, make sure Ukraine doesn't lose. Because, of course, Ukraine at the moment is the buffer, the strategic sort of depth that keeps Russia away from NATO. It's putting up a heroic resistance. And if the Ukrainians win and join NATO, the Ukrainians will defend NATO in the future with the army that knows more about how to fight and beat Russians than any other army in Europe. So I think, if that is the true scenario, then the first conclusion I would draw is, let's make sure that Ukraine survives, because that is our strategic interest.
NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg also called for increased support for Ukraine during a meeting with the U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin.
But NATO allies are providing unprecedented support to Ukraine. And it is important that we continue to do so. Our support to Ukraine is not charity, it is an investment in our own security, because the world will become more dangerous if President Putin wins in Ukraine, and this is also closely watched in China.
The Secretary General recalled that NATO was initially created to prevent wars. Therefore, in his opinion, both the alliance and the United States should support Ukraine at a certain stage, invited to become a full member of NATO. Reported by Diana Kolesnik, Христина Домбровська, UATV News.